Snow crunched under heavy boots. Garrett laughed, tossing aside a ragged cloak. He thought Isolde was dead frozen in unforgiving winter storms. Weak Omegas never survived exile. But when heavy iron doors swung open, laughter died in his throat. Beside King Alaric stood a woman wearing rich furs, silver crown resting on raven hair. Amber eyes met his cold and indifferent. She wasn't broken. She ruled. The rejection was not a spectacle. There was no grand assembly, no roaring fires casting dramatic shadows against the stone walls of the great hall. It happened on a dreary Tuesday morning, smelling faintly of wet dog and stale ale. Garrett didn't even look at her when he said it. He was adjusting the leather vambraces on his forearms, preparing for a hunt. Isolde stood by the hearth holding a basket of folded linens. Her hands were raw from lye soap and winter water. "It's not working, Isolde." He mumbled, his focus entirely on a stubbornly tight buckle. She paused. "The stitching." "Us." He finally looked up. His eyes, once a source of warmth in the bitter Iron Ridge winters, held the detached calculation of a merchant inspecting damaged goods. "I need an Luna who can command the war room, who brings alliances. Lord Corbin's daughter has 300 fighting wolves. You have a quiet voice and a knack for sums." Isolde didn't scream. She didn't throw the basket. A cynical, icy dread simply settled at the base of her spine. She had spent 5 years keeping his ledgers, managing his stores, nursing his pack through a sweating sickness that decimated the southern territories. She knew the name of every pup in Iron Ridge. She knew how much grain they had left before the frost. "You're discarding me for an army?" she stated. A simple fact. "I'm securing my borders." Garrett corrected his tone, hardening. "Pack law dictates an unbonded Omega without a clear function must be released. You have until nightfall to pack your things." Just like that. 5 years reduced to an afternoon's packing. The exile was a death sentence dressed up as mercy. Winter had already begun its assault on the mountains. The wind carried a bite that stripped the heat from human skin in seconds. Isolde left Iron Ridge with a wool-lined cloak, a flint and half a loaf of stale rye bread. No horse, no guard. The heavy iron gates slammed shut behind her, the metallic clang echoing through the barren pines. She walked north. There was nowhere else to go. The southern territories belonged to Corbin Garrett's new father-in-law. To the east lay the sea, frozen and hostile. The north was suicide, but it was a quiet suicide. For 3 days she starved. The romance of the wild is a lie told by men sitting in warm castles. The reality was dirty, snow-cracked lips and the humiliating ache of an empty stomach. She slept in the hollows of rotted trees, burying herself in dead pine needles to trap whatever pathetic body heat she had left. Her boots leaked. Her toes lost feeling by the second morning. She didn't cry over Garrett. Tears froze and cracked the skin. She cried because she had been stupid. She had believed that utility and loyalty were armor. They weren't. In a world governed by fangs and territory being useful without being dangerous simply made you a servant. On the 4th day the blizzard hit. The world erased itself in a screaming wall of white. Isolde stumbled blindly, her hands numb claws clutching the edges of her frozen cloak. Her lungs burned with every intake of frigid air. The snow was knee-deep, dragging at her legs like heavy mud. Eventually her knees gave out. She fell face-first into a snowdrift. It was oddly peaceful. The stinging stopped. A heavy, lethargic warmth began to spread through her limbs. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl. Get up, a rational part of her mind whispered. She ignored it. Dying was much easier than walking. Then a sudden, brutal pressure closed around her ankle. She was yanked backward. Isolde gasped, thrashing weakly as she was flipped onto her back. Through the blinding snow, towering silhouettes blocked out the pale grey sky. Wolves, massive shaggy beasts with fur thick with ice. A man shifted, rising from the snow as if born from it. He didn't bother with clothes. He stood naked in the blizzard, impervious to the cold, his chest heavily scarred. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Please," she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. The man grunted. He reached down, grabbed the collar of her cloak, and hauled her up over his shoulder like a sack of dead weight. He didn't ask her name. He didn't care. To the scouts of Dyrapeak, she was just debris in the snow. Isolde woke to the sharp, pungent scent of burning pine pitch and roasting meat. She was lying on a pallet of straw in a corner of a massive, echoing kitchen. The heat was overwhelming, pressing down on her frozen skin until it throbbed with agonizing pins and needles. Drink. A wooden bowl was shoved under her nose. A gruff woman with thick, muscular arms and a heavily scarred cheek glared down at her. Isolde scrambled up, wincing as her stiff joints popped. She took the bowl with trembling hands and drank. It was a greasy, salty broth that burned her throat and settled heavily in her shrunken stomach. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She had been brought to the fortress of Dyrapeak, the stronghold of King Alaric. In Ironridge, mothers used Alaric's name to frighten their children into obedience. They called him the Butcher of the Frost, a feral alpha who tore men apart with his bare hands and drank from their skulls. They said his pack was a legion of savages. The reality, Isolde quickly learned, was far more pragmatic. Dyrapeak wasn't a den of savages. It was a militarized machine. Everyone had a purpose. The weak didn't survive here, not because they were killed, but because the environment naturally weeded them out. Once she could stand, she was put to work. There was no interrogation, no audience with the terrifying king. She was an extra mouth to feed, so she had to earn her keep. She scrubbed iron pots until her fingernails cracked. She plucked geese until her hands were covered in tiny, bloody nicks. She gutted fish-hauled ash from the hearths and slept in a cramped alcove off the scullery. She preferred it to Ironridge. Here she was nothing. Nobody lied to her about love or pack loyalty. The contract was brutally simple work, and you eat. Fail and you starve. It was 3 weeks before she saw him. The great hall of Dyrapeak was a cavernous space of black basalt and massive oak beams. Isolde was on her hands and knees late one night, scraping hardened candle wax off the stone floor near the high table. The hall was empty. The fire burned low to glowing embers. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the archway. Isolde paused, keeping her head down. Servants were meant to be invisible. The boots stopped a few feet from her, black leather scuffed and stained with salt and old blood. "You missed a spot." His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It sounded like stones grinding together. Isolde sat back on her heels and looked up. King Alaric was not the towering monster the rumors suggested, but he was imposing. He possessed a dense, coiled energy like a trap waiting to spring. His dark hair was tied back, revealing a face composed of sharp angles and brutal scars. 3 jagged lines tracked down the left side of his face, slicing through his eyebrow and pulling at the corner of his mouth. His left eye was milky and blind. His right eye, however, was a piercing, assessing amber. He held a tankard of ale, looking down at her with mild curiosity. "My lord," Isolde said, keeping her voice flat. She didn't cower. She was too tired to cower. She took her iron scraper and chipped away the wax he had pointed out. Alaric watched her. "You're the stray my scouts dragged in from the pass. You don't smell like the north." "I am from the south." "Corbin's territory." "Ironridge," she corrected. "Garrett's pack," Alaric snorted, walking past her to sit in a heavy wooden chair by the dying fire. He stretched out his long legs. "Garrett is a fool who cares more about the polish on his armor than the grain in his silos. Why did you leave—" Isolde resumed her scraping. "He found a Luna with an army. I only had a head for numbers. I was excess." Silence stretched in the hall, broken only by the scrape of iron on stone and the crackle of the embers. Alaric took a slow drink of his ale. Numbers. He mused. My quartermaster died of the rot last moon. The man who replaced him is a warrior. He counts sacks of flour by hitting them with a stick. We are losing yield to dampness because he doesn't understand ventilation. Isolde paused. She looked at the king. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the fire, his jaw tight with exhaustion. The Butcher of the Frost looked remarkably like a man drowning in administrative failure. If you stack the sacks on wooden pallets raised 6 inches off the stone and rotate them every 10 days, the damp won't settle, Isolde said quietly. And you need to mix the older flour with the new to prevent weevil infestations. Alaric turned his head slowly. His one good eye pinned her to the floor. You know this. I ran Iron Ridge's stores for 5 years. We never lost a single sack to the damp. Alaric set his tankard down. He stood up and walked back over to her, towering above her kneeling form. He reached down. For a brief, terrifying second, Isolde thought he was going to strike her. Instead, his large, calloused hand grasped her upper arm and hauled her to her feet. Tomorrow, Alaric commanded, you do not report to the kitchens. You report to the ledger room. If you can fix my grain problem, you get a room with a hearth. If you fail, I throw you back out into the snow. He released her and walked away. Isolde stood in the empty hall, clutching her wax scraper. A strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered in her chest. Not hope. Hope was dangerous. It was purpose. The ledger room of Dyrapeak was a chaotic mess of poorly stacked scrolls, spilled ink, and frantic men trying to solve logistical nightmares with swords. Isolde walked in the next morning, took one look at the ledgers, and threw half of them into the fire. She spent the next 6 months dragging Dyrapeak's supply chain out of the Dark Ages. She worked dawn until midnight. She fought with stubborn pack elders, she screamed at lazy quartermasters, and she commanded a respect that had nothing to do with physical strength. She was relentless. And Alaric watched. He began visiting the ledger room late at night. At first it was strictly business. He would sit on the edge of her desk, nursing a cup of wine, listening to her explain trade routes and winter rationing. He asked sharp, intelligent questions. He didn't coddle her, and he never spoke down to her. Then the conversations shifted. They stopped talking about grain and started talking about the packs, about the burdens of leadership, about the isolation of being at the top, or in Isolde's case, the bottom. You don't flinch when I look at you. Alaric noted one evening. Outside, a spring storm was lashing against the high windows. The fire in the ledger room cast long, dancing shadows. Isolde looked up from her inkwell. Should I? He touched the ruined side of his face. Most do. They see the beast. They expect me to bite. I've known men with beautiful, unblemished faces. Isolde said, her voice dropping into a cynical rasp. They were cowards who threw women out into blizzards to secure political favors. Scars just mean you survived something. I prefer survivors. Alaric's gaze softened, a rare, startling expression on his harsh features. He stepped closer. The air between them suddenly felt thick, charged with the heavy static of a looming storm. He reached out his rough thumb, tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was incredibly gentle for a man with hands built for murder. You are wasted on ledgers, Isolde. He murmured. It is what I am good at. You are good at surviving. He corrected. You are good at seeing the flaws in the foundation. I don't need a scribe. I need an equal. He didn't claim her like a feral animal. He didn't speak of fate or magical mate bonds. He offered her a partnership built on mutual respect, forged in the freezing misery of the North. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't a frenzied assault. It was deliberate, heavy, and grounding. It tasted of dark wine and impending power. Isolde moved into his chambers the next day. She didn't cower behind his throne. She sat beside it. She streamlined his armies. She opened trade with the eastern seaports. The pack didn't challenge her. Wolves respected strength, and Isolde possessed a terrifying, quiet strength that made even the hardest veterans of Dyrapeak dip their heads in deference. By the time the first snows of the next winter began to fall, Isolde wasn't just the king's mate. She was the Queen of the North. Then the raven arrived. Alaric brought the small scroll to their chambers. He tossed it onto the heavy oak table where Isolde was reviewing tax records. He looked irritated. "Ironridge is starving," Alaric said, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "The southern harvest failed. They had a blight in their stores. They are begging for a summit. They want a loan of grain and salted meat." Isolde stopped writing. She stared at the small, rolled parchment. It bore the wax seal of a wolf, howling at a crescent moon. Garrett's seal. "He wants to come here," she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "He is coming here," Alaric corrected. "With his new Luna. They bring 20 guards. It is a pathetic show of force for a man coming to beg." Alaric walked up behind her, resting his heavy hands on her shoulders. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "I can turn them away at the gates. I can let them freeze in the pass. Say the word." Isolde closed her eyes. She remembered the cold. She remembered the pain in her fingers, the humiliation of dragging herself through the mud while Garrett adjusted his vambraces. She remembered feeling utterly hopelessly small. She opened her eyes. The amber light of the fire reflected in them, hard and unyielding. "No," Isolde said softly. "Let him come. Let him sit in our hall. Let him see exactly who holds the grain." Alaric chuckled a low, dark sound that vibrated against her back. "Merciful." "Not at all." She turned her head to look at him. "A quick death in the snow is mercy. I want him to look up at the high table and realize he threw away the only thing that could have saved him." The preparations for the summit were meticulous. Isolde oversaw every detail. She commanded the kitchens to prepare an obscene feast, roasted boars, dripping with fat mountains of spiced root vegetables, flagons of heavy sweet wine. She wanted the hall to reek of excess. She wanted the starving wolves of Ironridge to choke on the scent of Dyra Peak's prosperity. On the night of the arrival, the wind was howling through the peaks, driving a fresh sheet of ice against the fortress walls. Isolde sat beside Alaric at the high table. She did not wear the simple wool of her past. She wore a gown of deep crimson velvet lined with thick black wolf fur. A circlet of forged silver rested on her dark hair. The heavy iron doors of the great hall groaned open. Garrett stepped inside, followed by his guards and a frail-looking woman huddled in expensive but travel-stained furs. Lord Corbin's daughter. Garrett looked terrible. He was thinner, his face drawn and pale. The armor he was so proud of looked dull and poorly maintained. His eyes darted around the cavernous hall, taking in the roaring fires, the well-fed soldiers, the sheer crushing wealth of the north. He approached the dais, his head bowed. He didn't look up immediately. "King Alaric." Garrett began, his voice strained. He sounded tired, defeated. "We thank you for receiving us. The southern territories have suffered a grievous blow." Alaric lounged in his throne, swirling the wine in his goblet. He didn't say a word. He just waited. Garrett shifted uncomfortably, finally lifting his head to address the king. His eyes tracked upward, moving past Alaric's heavy boots, past the broad chest to the king's scarred face. And then his gaze drifted to the right. Garrett stopped breathing. The carefully rehearsed speech died in his throat. He stared, his eyes widening in a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a profound, agonizing realization. Isolde sat effortlessly in her carved chair. She held a goblet of gold in one hand, resting her chin on the knuckles of the other. She didn't glare. She didn't smile. She looked down at him with the utter crushing indifference of a god watching an ant struggle in the dirt. She wasn't the broken, quiet Omega he had thrown into the cold. She was a weapon forged in the ice, sitting beside the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Garrett's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from Isolde to the terrifying king, whose hand rested casually on the arm of her throne. Alaric leaned forward, a predator's smile stretching his scarred cheek. Welcome to Dyrapeak Alpha, Garrett. Alaric rumbled. My queen informs me you are bad at math. Let us see if we can teach you how to count your losses. The silence in the great hall was absolute. It wasn't a quiet born of respect, but a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Garrett's jaw worked soundlessly. His eyes darted from the heavy silver crown resting on Isolde's dark hair to the scarred, amused face of King Alaric. He didn't bow. He forgot how. Beside him, his new Luna, a fragile woman named Rosamond, tugged nervously at his sleeve. She didn't understand the history in the room, but she understood the sudden predatory shift in the atmosphere. The guards of Dyrapeak had stopped drinking. Their hands rested casually near the hilts of their daggers. My queen. Alaric repeated the title rolling off his tongue with a dark, deliberate weight. Did you not hear the Alpha of Ironridge his pack is suffering? Isolde finally leaned back against the carved wood of her chair. She looked at Garrett, really looked at him. The broad shoulders that used to carry the weight of her world now just looked stooped. The arrogant tilt of his chin was gone, replaced by the nervous twitch of a man who knew he was cornered. I heard him, Isolde said. Her voice carried easily over the crackling hearths. It wasn't the soft, accommodating tone she had used when mending his shirts. It was smooth, hard, and perfectly polished. Sit, Alpha Garrett. You have travelled far. You smell of frost and desperation. Eat? She gestured lazily to the long wooden tables below the dais. The feast was an exercise in psychological warfare. Isolde watched with clinical detachment as the Ironridge delegation was seated before plates piled high with roasted venison-glazed parsnips and thick, crusty bread oozing with churned butter. For wolves who had spent the last 2 months rationing bone broth and sawdust bread, the sight of so much food was agonizing. Propriety vanished. Garrett's guards tore into the meat with desperate, greasy fingers. Rosamond picked at a piece of pheasant, her stomach too shrunken to handle the rich fat, her eyes darting fearfully around the hall. Garrett barely ate. He sat stiffly, his knuckles white around a pewter goblet of wine. He kept stealing glances at the high table. Isolde ate a small piece of salted pork. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply existed in a space of total security, a stark contrast to the man who had cast her out to die. Alaric sat beside her, massive and relaxed, occasionally leaning over to murmur something in her ear. Every time he did, Garrett flinched. He's waiting for you to scream at him. Alaric noted quietly, picking a piece of lint off his black sleeve. Screaming requires emotional investment. Isolde replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the hall. He isn't worth the breath. He looks like he swallowed a stone. He swallowed his pride. She corrected. It sits heavier. Midway through the feast, Garrett could no longer tolerate the crushing weight of his own irrelevance. He stood his chair, scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound cut through the low hum of conversation. The hall fell silent again. King Alaric. Garrett called out, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a deeper register. I did not come to gorge on your hospitality. My people are dying. The southern blight took our winter wheat, and a sickness swept through the sheep. We need a loan of 500 sacks of grain and 200 barrels of salted meat. He paused, swallowing hard. We will repay you with interest after the spring thaw. On my honor as an alpha. Alaric didn't answer. He didn't even look at Garrett. The king of Dyrapeak slowly turned his head to look at Isolde, offering her a slight deferential nod. It was a subtle gesture, but in the hierarchy of wolves it was a thunderclap. The king was deferring to the queen. Garrett's face flushed a dull, angry red. He was being forced to negotiate with the woman he had discarded like spoiled meat. Isolde picked up a linen napkin, dabbed the corner of her mouth, and set it down. She met Garrett's furious, humiliated gaze. 500 sacks, she repeated. And you promise repayment in the spring, on your honor. Yes, your honor. Isolde mused the words, dripping with a cold, metallic irony. "Is a highly volatile currency, Garrett. It tends to vanish when the snow falls." Garrett's hands slammed flat on the wooden table. "Isolde." Queen Isolde, a massive Dire-Apik guard behind him corrected, driving the butt of a heavy spear into the stone floor with a deafening crack. Garrett swallowed his anger, forcing his hands to unclench. "Queen Isolde, whatever grievance you have with me, do not punish my pack. There are pups starving in Iron Ridge. I am well aware of who is in Iron Ridge." She stated, "I know the names of the pups. I delivered 3 of them. I also know that if you had a blight in your winter wheat, it means you didn't rotate the silos in late summer. And if a sickness swept your sheep, it means you didn't cull the infected herd at the first sign of limp rot." She leaned forward, her amber eyes locking onto his. There was no pity in them, just mathematics. Your pack isn't starving because of bad luck, Garrett. They are starving because you are an incompetent manager who spent the harvest season hunting border skirmishes instead of preparing for winter. You married an army? She nodded briefly toward the trembling Rosamond, but you forgot to feed them. Garrett looked like he had been struck across the face. The silence in the hall was absolute. His own guards were looking at the table, unable to meet his eye, because they knew she was right. "We will discuss terms in the war room tomorrow at dawn." Isolde finished her tone, indicating the audience was over. "Eat your fill tonight, Alpha. Tomorrow you pay for it." The war room of Dire-Apik was a brutal, windowless chamber buried deep within the keep. The walls were lined with maps drawn on cured animal hides. A massive oak table dominated the center, covered in heavy iron markers representing packs and troop movements. When Garrett entered at dawn, he looked worse than he had the night before. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and purple. He had likely not slept a wink, tortured by the sound of the wind and the ghosts of his own colossal mistakes. Alaric was already there, leaning against the far wall in a simple dark tunic, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a bored executioner waiting for the paperwork to clear. Isolde stood at the head of the table. She wore a tailored leather bodice over a grey wool dress. Her hair was braided back tightly. She looked like a soldier preparing for a siege. Garrett stopped at the opposite end of the table. He looked past Isolde, directing his plea to the king. "Alaric, let us speak man to man." Alaric snorted a harsh, grating sound. "I am a King Garrett. You are a beggar with a rotting territory. We are not men of equal standing. Speak to the ledger." He tipped his head toward Isolde. Garrett gritted his teeth and looked at his former mate. He tried to soften his eyes, trying to summon a ghost of the affection that had died 5 years ago. "Isolde, please. We were family once. We were a transaction." Isolde corrected coldly. "And you terminated the contract. Now we are negotiating a new one." She unrolled a heavy parchment on the table. "You asked for 500 sacks of grain and 200 barrels of meat. Dire-Apik can provide this. We will also provide 100 blocks of rendered fat and 50 crates of root vegetables to prevent scurvy in your pups." Garrett's eyes widened with desperate hope. "You have my gratitude. Iron Ridge will owe you a great debt." "Yes, you will." Isolde agreed. She picked up a quill and dipped it in an inkwell. "Here are the terms of that debt. You will not repay us in the spring. You do not have the infrastructure to recover that quickly. You will repay us over the next 10 years. Garrett frowned. 10 years. The interest on that, there is no interest. Garrett blinked. He didn't understand. Instead of interest, Isolde continued, her voice flat and unyielding. Iron Ridge will cede control of the Silver Pine logging routes to Dire-Apik. Garrett choked on a breath. The Silver Pine routes, that's half our timber trade. It is 50% of a trade you currently cannot maintain because your lumberjacks are too weak to swing an axe. Isolde pointed out logically. Furthermore, the Southern Mountain Pass will no longer be under your jurisdiction. You will pull your guards back to the river. Dire-Apik will garrison the pass. You're stripping my borders. Garrett shouted, slamming a fist on the table. The illusion of diplomacy vanished. "You're taking my land. I am taking your debt," Isolde said, completely unfazed by his outburst. "And my final term, Ironridge will no longer hold the status of a sovereign pack. You will kneel to Dirapeak. You will become a vassal state. You will pay a tithe of 20% of your autumn harvest to this fortress every year in perpetuity." Garrett stared at her in horror. He wasn't just losing a trade route. He was losing his crown. He was losing everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed her to secure. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I have done it," Isolde replied. She turned the parchment around and slid it across the heavy oak table. It stopped inches from his hands. "Sign it, or get on your horse ride back to your starving army and watch them eat each other before the solstice." Garrett looked at Alaric, seeking any sign of mercy. The king was watching Isolde with a look of profound, terrifying devotion. There was no help there. "You're doing this out of spite," Garrett hissed, his voice trembling. "Because I chose Rosamond. Because I chose her army over you." Isolde finally smiled. It was a small, chilling thing that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't care about your new wife, Garrett, and I don't care about your army. Spite is a weapon for the weak. This," she tapped a long finger against the parchment. "This is mathematics. You are a poor investment, and I am buying your pack for pennies on the dollar. Sign." The silence in the war room stretched until it felt like a physical pressure in the ears. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside the thick stone walls. Slowly, his hands shaking, Garrett picked up the quill. He didn't read the document again. He couldn't bear to see the words that formally stripped him of his pride. He scratched his signature at the bottom, his name looking small and jagged against the heavy, elegant script of the treaty. He dropped the quill. It rolled off the parchment, leaving a small smear of black ink on the wood. "It is done," he rasped. Isolde pulled the parchment back. She sprinkled sand over the ink, blew it off, and rolled it shut. "The wagons are already loaded in the courtyard. My soldiers will escort you back to Ironridge to ensure the food is distributed properly. We wouldn't want the Alpha's table to be full while the pups starve." It was a final parting knife to the ribs. Garrett turned away. He didn't look back as he walked out of the heavy iron doors. The courtyard of Dirapeak was a chaotic symphony of cracking whips, stamping hooves, and the heavy groans of wooden wagon wheels burdened with thousands of pounds of survival. The snow was falling lightly, dusting the dark stones in white. Isolde stood on the upper battlements, wrapped in her thick wolf fur cloak. The cold didn't bother her anymore. It felt like an old friend. Down below, Garrett was mounting his horse. He looked small amidst the massive Dirapeak guards and the towering wagons of grain. He pulled his cloak tight around his neck. Before he spurred his horse forward, he paused. He looked up, his eyes scanning the battlements until they locked onto Isolde. Even from this distance, she could see the complex knot of emotions twisting his features. Regret, anger, humiliation, and a deep, agonizing sorrow for a past he had carelessly burned to the ground. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He simply sat there for a long moment, bearing the weight of her stare. Isolde didn't offer him a parting gesture either. She watched him with the same detached calculation she used to survey her supply ledgers. The ledger on Garrett was closed. The balance was settled. Garrett finally broke the gaze. He turned his horse and rode out through the heavy iron gates of Dirapeak, trailing behind the wagons that held his survival and his subjugation. "He will never forgive you," a deep voice rumbled. Alaric stepped up beside her. He didn't wear a cloak, seemingly impervious to the biting wind. He leaned his forearms against the stone parapet, looking out at the disappearing caravan. "I didn't ask for his forgiveness," Isolde said softly. "And I don't require it." "He thought you were a soft thing," Alaric mused. "A quiet little bird he could toss out of the nest." He turned his head to look at her, his amber eye tracking the sharp line of her profile. "He didn't realize you were the stone the nest was built on." Isolde turned to him. The wind caught a strand of her dark hair, whipping it across her face. Alaric reached out his large, scarred hand, brushing the hair away his thumb, lingering on her cheekbone. "Are you satisfied?" he asked. Isolde looked back down at the empty courtyard. The wagons were gone. The tracks in the snow were already beginning to fill in, erasing the evidence that the Alpha of Ironridge had ever been there. She thought about the cold. She thought about the hollow tree where she had prepared to die. She thought about the terrified, desperate woman she had been. That woman was dead, buried under the snows of Dirapeak. In her place stood a queen who held the lives of thousands in her ink-stained fingers. Satisfaction implies I was seeking revenge, Isolde said, leaning into the warmth of Alaric's hand. I was only seeking order. An equation left unbalanced creates chaos. Today, the ledger is balanced. Alaric chuckled, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. He leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of fiery, desperate romance. It was a seal of absolute partnership. Remind me never to miscalculate our stores. He murmured against her skin. I fear you would conquer the continent just to fix the math. Only if the math was sloppy. Isolde replied, a genuine, quiet smile, finally touching the corners of her mouth. Together they turned away from the battlements, leaving the freezing wind and the ghost of Garrett behind them. They walked back into the warmth of the fortress, back to the war room, back to the ledgers, and the messy, brutal business of ruling the north. The winter was long, but they had plenty of grain, and they had each other. And for a woman who had once been nothing but excess, having everything was a remarkably warm feeling. Winter did not leave Dirapeak. It merely retreated, surrendering the lower valleys to a brutal, muddy spring. The snowmelt turned the mountain paths into treacherous rivers of brown sludge. The air smelled of wet, pine-raw earth and the sharp metallic tang of thawing rock. Inside the ledger room the fires burned lower, but the work never ceased. Isolde sat at the great oak table, her fingers stained with black ink. The treaty with Ironridge had kept the southern wolves alive. The wagons of grain and salted meat had arrived just as their reserves hit the bedrock. But survival was not a cure for incompetence, and gratitude had a remarkably short shelf life. The heavy door opened, scraping against the stone. Alaric walked in. He smelled of rain and wet leather. His dark hair was plastered to his neck, and his boots left thick tracks of mud across the floor. He didn't care. He walked directly to her table and dropped a crumpled parchment onto the open ledger. The wax seal was broken. It bore the crest of a roaring bear. Lord Corban. "Read it!" Alaric grunted, stripping off his heavy leather gauntlets. He moved to the small hearth, holding his hands out to the embers. Isolde flattened the damp parchment. She didn't need to read far. The aggressive, jagged scrawl told her everything she needed to know before she even processed the words. An illegal subjugation, extorted under duress. Ironridge answers to no northern savage. The tithe will not be paid. Any attempt to cross the river will be met with 300 spears. She sighed a thin, exhausted sound. She reached for her sandshaker and carefully blotted a stray drop of ink on her own ledger before addressing the letter. Garrett didn't write this. She observed, her voice maddeningly calm. Garrett is a puppet. Alaric growled, turning away from the fire. The scar on his face pulled tight, giving him a demonic cast in the low light. Corban rode into Ironridge 3 days ago with his personal guard. He found out his son-in-law signed away their sovereignty for a meal. He locked Garrett in the keep and declared the treaty void. His men are fortifying the river crossing. Alaric stepped closer to the table, planting his heavy fists on the wood. The coiled energy in him was terrifying, a physical pressure in the room. He insulted my claim. He threatened my borders. I am going to march south Isolde. I am going to tear Corban's throat out and mount Garrett's head on a pike at the river. It was a perfectly rational response for an Alpha King. It was exactly what Corban expected. Isolde picked up the letter and held it over a candle flame. The parchment curled, turned brown, and burst into bright orange fire. She dropped the burning remnants into an empty iron bowl on her desk and watched them turn to ash. "You aren't marching south," she said. Alaric's one good eye narrowed. "Do not test me on this. They broke the contract." "They are throwing a tantrum," Isolde corrected, looking up at him. "Corbin has 300 men. You have 800. You would win. But a battle in the spring mud will cost us 50, maybe 100 soldiers. It will cost us gold for mercenaries, iron for armor repairs, and weeks of time." She stood up, leaning over the table so she was eye to level with him. "Corbin wants a war because war is a language he understands. It gives him glory. It makes him a martyr to the southern packs. I refuse to pay 100 northern lives for a southern fool's pride." Alaric stared at her. His chest heaved with the suppressed urge for violence. "So we do nothing. We let them steal our grain and mock our borders." "I didn't say we do nothing." A cynical, icy smile touched Isolde's lips. "Corbin brought his personal guard to Ironridge. That means he added 300 mouths to a pack that is already relying on our rations to survive." She walked over to the massive map pinned to the wall. She picked up a black charcoal stick. "Corbin thinks like a warlord. He is defending the river crossing. But Ironridge doesn't get its salt from the river. It gets it from the eastern quarry." She drew a thick black X over a trade route. "They don't get their wool from the south. They get it from the highlands." Another X. She turned back to the king. "We don't march an army. We march 50 men to the eastern quarry and shut it down. We send the 20 men to the Highland Pass and turn back the wool merchants. We enforce the embargo. Corbin is sitting in a fortress with 300 bored, hungry soldiers. Let's see how long they respect him when the salt runs out and the meat turns rancid." Alaric looked at the map, then at the ashes in the iron bowl, and finally at his queen. The fury in his eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a dark, profound amusement. "You," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, "are a truly terrifying woman. I am an accountant, Alaric, and the southern books are severely unbalanced." The embargo was a masterpiece of bloodless cruelty. Isolde didn't burn villages. She didn't slaughter patrols. She simply severed the veins of Ironridge's economy. Northern scouts moving like ghosts in the spring fog intercepted every merchant wagon heading south. They paid the merchants double for their goods and sent them home. By the 4th week of the embargo, the reality of Corbin's bravado began to curdle. News trickled north through terrified informants. Corbin's 300 spears, initially eager for a fight, were now sitting in the damp, rotting barracks of Ironridge doing nothing. Without salt to cure their fresh kills, the spring hunts yielded meat that spoiled in days. The beer ran out. The morale plummeted. Garrett reportedly had not been seen outside his chambers in a month. He was a ghost in his own territory, eclipsed by the father-in-law whose army he had coveted. It broke in the 6th week. A messenger arrived at Direpeak under a flag of truce. He was one of Corbin's men wearing armor that was meant to be shining, but was currently caked in dried mud and rust. He didn't look arrogant. He looked tired. "Lord Corbin requests a parley," the man said, standing nervously in the great hall. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, intimidated by the sheer scale of the northern keep. "At the Silverpine Crossing." Isolde sat beside Alaric. She tapped a finger against the arm of her wooden chair. "A parley. Did he bring his 300 spears to this meeting?" "The vanguard is with him, your grace." The messenger swallowed hard. "About 50 men." Alaric let out a short, derisive bark of laughter. "He leaves 250 men behind because he knows if he brings them all, they will beg me for bread." He looked at Isolde. "Do we ride?" "We ride," Isolde agreed. "It is time to close the account." The journey to the Silverpine Crossing was miserable. The rain was a constant freezing drizzle that seeped through wool and leather. Isolde rode a sturdy roan gelding flanked by Alaric and a heavily armed escort of 50 Direpeak veterans. They didn't wear ceremonial armor. They wore boiled leather and heavy cloaks greased with animal fat to repel the water. They looked like what they were, predators perfectly adapted to a brutal environment. They reached the crossing at midday. The river was swollen with snowmelt rushing violently over grey stones. On the opposite bank stood Lord Corben and his men. The contrast was pathetic. Corben's soldiers wore chainmail that dragged heavily on their shoulders. Their horses looked nervous and thin. Corben himself sat atop a massive black stallion, wearing a surcoat bearing his roaring bear crest. He looked furious, a man trying to maintain the illusion of power while standing in the mud. Beside Corben sat Garrett. Isolde felt nothing when she saw him. The icy dread that had once paralyzed her was gone. Garrett looked completely hollowed out. His eyes were sunken, his posture slumped. He wasn't a leader anymore. He was a hostage in his own pack. Alaric spurred his massive warhorse forward, stopping at the very edge of the rushing water. He didn't shout. He let the silence hang, forcing Corben to speak first. "You choke our roads like cowards." Corben bellowed over the roar of the river. "You starve innocent pups." Isolde urged her horse forward, stopping beside Alaric. She pulled her hood back, letting the freezing rain hit her face. "The pups of Ironridge have grain," Isolde called back, her voice cutting through the damp air with sharp precision. "I made sure of it. It is your mercenaries who are starving, Lord Corben. Because I refuse to feed an army that threatens my borders." Corben's face flushed purple. "This treaty is a farce. Garrett had no right to sign away our sovereignty. He is a weak fool." Garrett flinched at the words, but he didn't argue. He just stared at the pommel of his saddle. "He had every right." Alaric rumbled, his voice carrying easily. "He is the Alpha. Or he was until you locked him in a tower. You talk of sovereignty, Corben, but you are nothing but a squatter in another man's keep. I am protecting my daughter's future." Corben drew his sword, the steel scraping loudly. His men behind him shifted nervously, hands going to their weapons. "We will not be vassals to the north. If you want this land, you will have to bleed for it." The tension spiked. 50 northern veterans leveled their spears. The rain hissed against the steel. It was the precipice of slaughter. Isolde didn't draw a weapon. She reached into a leather satchel strapped to her saddle and pulled out a heavy bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. She tossed it onto the muddy bank in front of her horse. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Corben narrowed his eyes. "What is that?" "That," Isolde said, "is a ledger of every debt Lord Corben owes to the Iron Bank of the eastern coast. 50,000 gold pieces borrowed to fund your little army." Corben froze. The colour drained from his face. "I opened trade with the East last winter." Isolde continued, casually brushing a raindrop off her cheek. "I bought your debt, Corben. All of it. Which means you don't own that armour. You don't own those horses. And you certainly don't own this territory." She looked past the warlord, locking eyes with the mercenaries behind him. "The man leading you is bankrupt. He cannot pay you. If you draw steel against the north today, you die in the mud for free." She raised her voice, projecting it over the rushing water. "Throw down your weapons. Ride back to your southern holdfasts. I will guarantee your safe passage, and I will issue a writ forgiving your captain's unpaid wages. You have 5 minutes to decide if you want to die for a man who doesn't own his own boots." The effect was instantaneous. Mercenaries were practical men. They fought for gold, not honor. They looked at Corben, who was stammering, his bluster completely shattered by the cold, hard reality of economics. A heavy, sickening clatter echoed across the river. One of Corben's lieutenants dropped his spear, then another. Within seconds, the vanguard of the roaring bear crest dissolved into a disorganized mob of men, turning their horses around. "Cowards!" Corben screamed, slashing his sword at the empty air. "Stand your ground!" No one listened. They were already riding south, desperate to escape the freezing rain and the terrifying Queen of the North. Corben was left sitting on his horse completely alone, save for Garrett. The warlord stared at Isolde, his chest heaving. He had prepared for a bloodbath. He had not prepared for an audit. "You," Corben choked out. "You are a witch. I am an accountant." Isolde corrected for the second time that month. Now get off my land before I have my men take your horse as partial payment. Corben didn't need to be told twice. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, he sheathed his sword, jerked his reins, and galloped after his fleeing men, leaving his daughter's pack behind. The drumming of hooves faded into the heavy, oppressive mist. The river roared a violent rush of grey snowmelt, violently carving its way through the stone valley. And then there was just the sound of the wind. Only Garrett remained on the southern bank. He didn't move. He sat atop his damp horse, a statue of rusted iron and ruined pride. Across the rushing water, a wall of 50 northern veterans sat motionless on their mounts, a terrifying monolith of boiled leather steel and total discipline. At their center sat Isolde and Alaric, perfectly calm in the biting damp. Garrett looked down at his hands. They were trembling. The heavy leather reins slipped through his fingers. He slowly swung his leg over the saddle, dropping heavily to the ground. His boots sank ankle-deep into the freezing grey mud. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't shout a final defiance. He just started walking forward, dragging his feet through the sludge until he reached the very edge of the rushing water. The icy spray dotted his pale face. He dropped to his knees. The mud swallowed the heavy iron greaves he wore. It was a total unconditional surrender. No terms, no dignity. Alaric watched him with an expression of profound, primal disgust. The king of Dirapeak gestured sharply with 2 fingers. 4 heavy-set northern guards spurred their horses into the shallows. They splashed across the crossing, completely indifferent to the freezing water. 2 of them dismounted, grabbed Garrett by his arms, and hauled him up. They didn't treat him like a fallen king. They treated him like a sack of spoiled grain. They dragged him through the freezing river, tossing him face first into the mud at the hooves of Isolde and Alaric's horses. Garrett coughed, spitting grit and dirty water from his mouth. He pushed himself up on shaking arms, his chainmail clinking dully. "Corben is gone," Garrett rasped. His voice was entirely hollow. It was the sound of a man who had already died on the inside. "The pack is yours. Iron Ridge is yours. Do what you will." Alaric stared down at him. For a wolf, this level of submission from a former alpha was an obscenity. It violated the natural order. "You let another man usurp your hall. You let your people starve while you hid in a tower. You are a disease in your own territory." The king drew a heavy, curved hunting knife from his belt. The thick leather sheath yielded to the steel with a quiet, lethal hiss. The blade caught the dull, grey light of the overcast sky. Pack law dictates that a failed, diseased alpha must be culled to protect the pack from rot. Alaric rumbled, shifting his weight in the saddle, preparing to dismount and do the butcher's work himself. Garrett didn't flinch. He closed his eyes and tilted his head back, exposing the pale, vulnerable flesh of his throat. He wanted it. He craved the blade. It was a rapid, violent end to a humiliation he could no longer carry. "Stop!" The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken with the crisp, measured cadence of a banker finding a clerical error. Alaric froze. He didn't sheathe the knife, but he stopped his descent. He looked over at Isolde, his golden eye narrowing in question. Isolde stared down at the man in the mud. She looked at his shaking, muddy hands. She looked at the matted hair plastered to his forehead. She felt absolutely nothing. No lingering affection, no fiery hatred. Just the cold, clear clarity of an equation finally snapping into focus. "Killing him is a mistake," Isolde said. Her voice, carried over the rushing water, meant only for the 3 of them. "It turns him into a tragic figure. It gives the stubborn elders in Iron Ridge an excuse to romanticize his memory over their winter fires. A dead alpha is a martyr. We do not need martyrs." She nudged her roan gelding a step closer. The horse snorted its hot breath, pluming in the damp air. Garrett opened his eyes. He looked up at her. The sheer terror in his gaze was pathetic. "You exiled me," Isolde said. Her words were perfectly spaced, falling like heavy stones. You told me an unbonded Omega without a clear function was a burden. You told me I had to be released to secure your borders. You gave me half a loaf of stale bread, a flint, and you locked the iron gates while the snow fell. Garrett squeezed his eyes shut. A wet, ragged sob tore from his throat. Isolde, I was wrong. I was so— Silence! The command was an absolute, physical force. Garrett's jaw snapped shut. His teeth clicked together audibly. I am not going to let him slit your throat, Garrett. She continued, her amber eyes devoid of all mercy. Because you are no longer a threat. You are not an alpha. You are not a warrior. You are excess, and excess must be discarded. She shifted her gaze to the captain of her guard, a massive brute of a man, sitting rigidly on his mount. Strip him, Isolde ordered. The guards moved with brutal efficiency. They hauled Garrett to his feet. They didn't bother with the intricate buckles of his armor. They drew their own knives and sliced through the thick leather straps. The heavy iron breastplate hit the mud with a wet slap. His chainmail followed, then his heavy fur-lined boots, and finally the thick woolen tunic bearing the crest of Iron Ridge. They left him in a thin, tattered undertunic and linen trousers. He stood barefoot in the freezing, rocky mud, his body convulsing violently from the cold. Isolde reached behind her saddle, untying a small bundle she had prepared that morning. She dropped it. It landed in the mud beside Garrett's bare, freezing toes. A coarse wool cloak. Isolde listed, staring right through him. A flint, and half a loaf of rye bread. Exactly what you calculated my life was worth. Garrett stared down at the bundle. He was shaking so hard his teeth chattered violently. Your new Luna Rosamond will remain in the keep under house arrest until she delivers her child, after which she may return to her father's bankrupt holdfast. Isolde decreed, laying out the final crushing terms of his reality. Dyrapeak will appoint a permanent steward to manage the southern territories. You, Garrett, are banished from the north, the south, and the eastern passes. If any patrol finds you within our borders, you will be shot on sight like a rabid dog. She looked down at him one last time. You have until nightfall to be out of my sight. Walk. Garrett stared at her. The full, crushing horror of his situation finally settled heavily on his chest. He had absolutely nothing. No pack to lead. No title to hide behind. No armor to keep him warm. He was exactly where she had been 5 years ago. But the brutal truth was undeniable. He was not a survivor. He was a parasite, violently detached from its host, left to rot in the cold. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He bent down with stiff, numb fingers clutching the coarse wool cloak and the flint. He pulled the thin fabric tightly around his shivering shoulders. Then he turned. He began to walk eastward toward the barren, treacherous, and rocky highlands. He stumbled over a large stone, fell to his knees in the mud, and dragged himself back up. He was a solitary, broken figure, shrinking against the massive, unforgiving backdrop of the mountain range. Isolde watched him go. She didn't feel a surge of triumphant adrenaline. She didn't feel vindicated or overly joyful. She felt a profound, heavy peace. The chaotic, bleeding wound in her past had finally been thoroughly cauterized. Beside her, Alaric finally sheathed his hunting knife. The click of the blade locking into place was the final punctuation mark on Garrett's reign. The massive king maneuvered his warhorse a fraction closer, the heavy animal bumping gently against hers. He reached over. His rough, heavily scarred hand covered hers on the wet leather reins. His grip was warm and fiercely grounding. The ledger is closed. Alaric murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated over the rushing water. Isolde looked away from the pathetic, vanishing speck in the distance. She turned to the formidable, scarred king who had pulled her from the snow and handed her a kingdom. She turned her hand over, intertwining her dark, ink-stained fingers tightly with his calloused ones. The ledger is closed, she agreed quietly. The tension finally bled completely from her shoulders. Now we have a starving southern pack to audit. The grain silos in Iron Ridge need their timber replaced before the summer solstice, or the damp will ruin the new harvest. Alaric threw his head back and laughed. It was a rich, booming sound that echoed across the river valley, entirely out of place in the dreary rain, yet perfectly fitting. It was the sound of a king who knew exactly the terrifying, brilliant value of the woman sitting beside him. "My queen," he said, still smiling, a deep affection warming his one good amber eye. "Lead the way." They turned their horses north. Together they rode back toward Dyera Peak, leaving the mud, the cold, and the ghosts far behind them. The winter had been brutally long, but the spring belonged entirely to the architects. If this epic tale of survival logic over brute force and the ultimate balancing of the scales kept you hooked, smash that like button. Subscribing to the channel ensures you never miss out on our grounded, gritty storytelling where actions actually have consequences. Did Isolde's bloodless victory satisfy your craving for vengeance? Or did Garrett deserve the blade? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this video with a friend who loves a ruthless queen. Keep those notifications on and we'll see you in the next story.